It is, in other words, a form of Platonism, the tradition that follows and builds on the teachings of Plato. And this is an important point. Platonism can be a broad category. We often divide it into periods in schools like Middle Platonism.
No, you want to stick it up like Vegeta's.
Late Platonism. But we should remember that they are all parts of a single tradition, at least in a sense, according to these philosophers themselves.
Focus is fine.
They all saw themselves as simply adhering to
Mine falls down a little bit sometimes.
Teachings of their master Plato. The word Neoplatonism is therefore often seen as somewhat problematic by scholars. It's not a word used by
because I'm not dancing as much as I was before. I'm singing as much either. I kind of know it.
Platonists, but this is rather a modern anachronistic term used by scholars and historians.
Can I lose it? No, never.
Neo means new, which seems to indicate that this was a new philosophy, but to the Neoplatonists, there was nothing neo about it. It was simply
some people shave it and you're like, no, I can still go back to this day. I know it.
Teachings. Therefore, many scholars, as well as myself,
I'm like, hey guys, grow back your room hair.
To use other
grow your hair out.
Like late
Let's see what it's like.
To refer to
is your crown chakra that big?
To highlight that it was not
shave your head for that reason, kind of
separate thing, but a late stage of development for the Platonic school of thought.
Grow your hair out.
And also, to some degree, also a late stage of development.
If you shave it,
or
if you don't,
and Hellenic philosophy.
Why do you wrap it up?
Furthermore, we should probably not look at Neoplatonism as a school at all, because that too is a modern academic construct. Many of the thinkers we categorize as Neoplatonists can differ in dramatic ways, as we will see.
Take your hats off.
So we should keep in mind that this is a general term used to denote a late-stage pagan Platonism, which has certain characteristic features that unify it, but which also can be incredibly diverse and complicated. In any case, it's clear that Neoplatonism was very innovative and has features that set it apart from earlier representatives of Platonism in general. So with that said, what is it then that makes Neoplatonism Neoplatonism? Well, the movement or school basically originated in
really evil, magical people out there
with an amazing figure called Plotinus. He's usually described as the quote-unquote founder of Neoplatonism.
No, it's like
many
that.
Of its characteristic teachings can be traced to him.
I'm not one of them.
That he actually takes them directly.
No, I'm like one of us.
Plotinus is one of the most fascinating, incredible, and indeed influential.
I'm not your kind of demon.
Time. And to understand Neoplatonism, we kind of need to understand.
I'm an elemental.
Him. Even though the school was further developed and associated with successive figures like Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus, Plotinus is kind of the man in this case, so it serves as well to explore him a bit more in depth. Plotinus lived in the 3rd century, as I mentioned. He was from Alexandria in Egypt originally, but was deeply Hellenized and spent most of his career as a philosopher in the city of Rome. He was well respected and famous during his lifetime, and we know of his ideas and teachings primarily through his writings, a collection of treatises compiled by his student Porphyry, known as the Enneads, and we'll return to this work later. But this is important because basically all we know about Plotinus' life comes from a short biography that Porphyry included as a kind of prologue to the Enneads, and which is called simply On the Life of Plotinus. In other words, it is the story of Plotinus' life as viewed from one of his own students.
Right. No, right. That's a good argument in court.
Truly amazing details. As I already mentioned, he was born in Egypt around the year 204 and grew up in the city of Alexandria in particular. Porphyry tells us that Plotinus was very secretive about his background and disliked talking about it, so we don't really know much at all about his early years. But sometime in his late 20s, he became interested in philosophy and started studying in Alexandria under a teacher called Ammonius Saccas. Porphyry tells us that Plotinus studied under Ammonius with 2 other students, Irenaeus and Origen. And you may recognize that later name because it is the name of one of the most famous early Christian philosophers and theologians. He was also from Alexandria, and so both the name, the time, and the place seem to suggest that this might be the same guy. In other words, Plotinus and the famous Origen might have been school buddies. Although the scholars continue to disagree about his true identity, many believe that there may have been 2 Origens, and that this is simply a coincidence that this name shows up here.
Oh, you're a Sue happy motherfucker. I knew it too.
Also tells us
you're a Sue happy motherfucker. One of you
were forced to promise never to reveal his teachings to others.
Where are my Sue happy motherfuckers?
because after traveling around the Mediterranean world for a while, Plotinus settled in the city of Rome.
You ever actually sued anybody?
And quickly became famous as a great philosopher that attracted many students.
You should try suing somebody.
He really became the philosopher of the
hey, you know what? Someone fucked me over one time.
An authority
so we don't do it anymore. We think it's an asshole thing to do.
No one could explain Plato.
They fuck you over. The business fucked you over one time.
Platonist doctrine in the world at the time. He certainly seems to have been a very charismatic figure, judging from these stories about his life. In some ways, he adopted a kind of semi-Pythagorean lifestyle, for example, by living a rather ascetic life, not eating very much and following a strictly vegetarian diet.
Coach, are you worth?
People from all walks of life, from senators to people of the lower classes, both men and women, would attend his lectures and hold him in great regard. And there was a kind of inner circle of close students, which included Porphyry.
Make that much money.
There are incredible stories about Plotinus's supposed spiritual powers and status. He, of course, lived in a world that was entirely dominated by
something like $120 an hour or more,
Greece and Rome, and he seems to have respected that religion to some degree, because we don't find any evidence in his writings that he was at all openly critical to the cult. But at the same time, he seems to have seen himself as being somewhat.
And they work hard. But they still feel like
things. What he was doing was philosophy, exploring the higher noetic realities and not these relatively lower practices associated with religion. In one of the more dramatic and striking parts of Porphyry's biography, he tells us of one time when Plotinus said something that was quite shocking to the people around him.
Yeah, they just have enough intelligence to make everyone else feel like it.
Was fond of sacrifices.
They're smarter than they are.
He used to busy himself with rites of
making safe quickly.
Fears.
Quite a bit, actually. He just lived down for a little while.
Plotinus said, "They must come to me, not I to them." We do not know what consideration led him to make such a grand announcement, and did not have the nerve to ask him. As we can see from this quote, even Porphyry himself and the rest of the crew seemed quite shocked by this seemingly impious statement, saying that the gods of the religious pantheon should come to him rather than the other way around, to the point that they didn't have the nerve to inquire about it anymore. Another story tells of how another philosopher, Olympius of Alexandria, was jealous of Plotinus and wanted to use magic to cast a spell and attack him. But once he did, he realized that Plotinus' soul was so powerful that all the attacks simply deflected back onto Olympius himself, forcing him to give up. Plotinus had cultivated his soul and noetic consciousness so much that it was a force to be reckoned with. Lastly, we can't recount Plotinus' life without mentioning the story about the summoning of his guardian daimon. Porphyry tells us that there was an Egyptian priest that came to visit Rome and wanted to demonstrate his powers by inviting Plotinus so that he could summon his protective daimon. So at this time, it was believed that each person had a protective daimon, an intermediary spirit between humans and gods. And this priest from Egypt could supposedly summon these daimons. Porphyry recounts the event thus, quote, "Plotinus readily agreed, and the invocation took place in the temple of Isis, since the Egyptians said that this was the only pure place he could find in Rome. When he called upon Plotinus' daimon to appear, it was a god that came, rather than a member of the genus of daimons. As the Egyptians said, 'You are blessed, since you have a god as your daimon, and are not accompanied by a member of the lower genus.' In any case, the fact that Plotinus was accompanied by a daimon of superior divinity led him to raise his godlike vision towards it. This is why he wrote the book On Our Allotted Daimon, in which he tries to explain why different people have different guardians. Again, we see here an example of Plotinus's impressive spiritual powers. His personal daimon was not just some old regular daimon, but an actual god. But despite these very lofty details, he was also just a guy, and is described as being pleasant, kind, and caring as an individual.
I feel them.
Indeed, many people, especially those who were about to die, would entrust their children to his care, and his house was quote, filled with boys and girls whom he looked after and cared for. So not only was he an incredibly well-respected philosopher, but also kind of a well-respected person in general in his society. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the fact that our information comes from a devoted disciple, he's also described as rather pleasant to look at. We do have depictions of Plotinus, even though he personally refused to be painted or sculpted, saying, quote, Isn't it enough that I have to carry around the image that nature has clothed me with? Like a true Platonist, he believed that everything in the visible world, including our bodies, are only imperfect images or copies or reflections of the perfect world of forms in the nous. So to paint an image or make a sculpture of him would be to paint an even more imperfect image of an already imperfect image. And he wasn't about that. Porphyry tells us that they cheated, though, and got a famous painter and sculptor to attend Plotinus' lectures and memorize his looks so that he could later recreate it. Thus, we have depictions that are supposedly pretty close to real life. Plotinus, sadly, was sick for a lot of his life, having a lot of problems with his bowels, and became afflicted with nasty throat infection, which in the year 270, when he was 66 years old, finally resulted in his passing. The greatest philosopher of his day and one of the most significant thinkers in world history breathed his last with the words, quote, "Try to elevate the God within us to the divine in the universe." Plotinus' legacy is incredibly vast, and we are lucky that basically all of his philosophical writings survive. And after his death, our friend Porphyry decided to take all of those treatises and compile them into a single, albeit incredibly messy, collection. Still, a magnificent work of philosophy, which became known as the Enneads.
I know that feeling.
Ennead means a group of 9, and the work essentially consists of 54 treatises divided into 6 Enneads. That is, 6 groups of 9 treatises
you know
each. This division and structure is entirely by Porphyry, and it's really weird. It divides single treatises into many and has a pretty confusing outline based on a loose kind of thematic structure. Nonetheless, this work would play a major role in the history of philosophy and religion, sometimes under other names and in misattributed forms, which we'll touch on in future episodes. But it is in these Enneads that we find the teachings of Plotinus, and therefore also the foundational ideas of late Platonism or Neoplatonism. So what is this guy all about? Well, it's worth pointing out once again that Plotinus simply sees himself as clarifying and explicating the teachings of Plato. So the contents of his Neoplatonic philosophy is based strongly on the Platonic dialogues and incorporates many of the characteristic thoughts
of Plato,
the world of forms,
for example.
He seems especially interested and influenced by some specific dialogues, such as, for example, the Parmenides, where we get ideas about the
now I think I know better than everybody.
Seen as Plato's most mature and complex metaphysical
older
dialogue.
Than you.
And also, very importantly, for those of you who know your Plato, you'll know that he had quite an esoteric side, and that he famously dissed the whole project of writing philosophy. For this reason, there is often talk about Plato's so-called unwritten doctrines. Those ideas
my
that
dad
never
told me,
down,
my teacher said,
and
I saw on YouTube one time,
ideas.
and I'm guessing
and this wasn't
mostly.
some later invention either, as Aristotle himself, one of Plato's students,
I watched documentaries, a lot of commercials. I wasn't really paying attention,
hints as to what they
but I kind of know
about.
something
Without
else about
deeply
something
into
that I
it, we
saw in
can
a
say
movie,
that it seems
and I was
like
like,
these
yeah, it
secret
must be
true
true because it's not a
doctrines
movie.
were strongly
And I'm like,
related
yeah.
to ideas
And then I think of
associated
a homeless
with
guy.
Pythagoreanism, such as a huge emphasis on the idea that the foundations of reality is based on a monad and a dyad, a one and
Right, no, I
successive
used to do
two,
drugs and I'm sober
esoteric
too.
number metaphysics.
So I get that one.
And Plotinus seems to be influenced and claims to represent and teach these unwritten
I think I know something about
doctrines.
brain chemistry, but
This is
I don't.
unsurprising when we consider the fact that the very core of his philosophy consists of the idea of the one, which we will get to soon.
No, it's not
So
real,
he
and I
bases his
figured it
philosophy
out.
on
No, it's
Plato,
fucking fake.
on his
This guy feels as
dialogues,
smart
the
as me,
unwritten doctrines,
and I know
and the Platonic tradition that developed afterwards. So Plotinus follows in a strong and flourishing tradition
And
of
by my
wisdom,
standards, you're fucking
including not only
retarded.
Platonism, but
You
also
don't believe
other
in God
schools
that
such
way.
as Stoicism. He really was the philosopher of his day, as we said. And despite how much he wants to claim that he is simply relaying the teachings of Plato, there's no denying that he was incredibly innovative and original himself.
One hell of an investment, if you ask
Neoplatonism
me.
is such a significant school of thought and school of philosophy. It's kind of the culmination of the whole project of Hellenic philosophy. Plotinus takes inspiration from the Platonic tradition, from Plato, but also certain aspects from Aristotle, the peripatetic philosophy. He also takes certain aspects of Stoicism, and he creates this incredible system. He we can call it a system, this incredible philosophy that we now know as Neoplatonism. It's really significant and really, really important stuff. It's really difficult to know where to begin when it comes to Neoplatonism. But
you know what I mean?
In the most general strokes, we can say that it is a philosophy that conceives of different levels of reality. These levels or realities, perhaps, being referred to as hypostases in the original Greek. At the core of this entire system, at the core of reality itself, and you could say its highest level, is the concept of the one, tohen.
We pulled a yardstick, measured my chest, and reports, and be like, oh yeah, he's right, the caller's right. She's taller now.
It's beyond being, it's beyond time and space.
Like, okay, Doug, yeah, look at his mustache. Is that natural mustache? Yeah, it's natural mustache.
Is actually saying too much.
You're like, okay, what next, Taran?
The apophatic principle, something that lies completely beyond the light of human understanding and its concepts. But it is from this one, and kind of this one, that everything else unfolds. We will return to the incredible way that Plotinus describes, or perhaps undescribes, the one in the Enneads later, but it is, in short, an utter simplicity from which everything else emanates.
Right.
It's also identified with the Platonic concepts of the good and the beautiful, and these three terms are sometimes used interchangeably to refer to this one concept of the one. Now, basically, everything I say here is going to have to be nuanced and maybe even
later on.
But we'll begin with a simple overview. From this one, there's a kind of
and where they can take you.
Something appears
and
which
take
is
it over
distinct
that
from
realm.
the one, but it's simultaneously kind of the same at the same time. The
From
one is so
schizophrenics,
perfect that it overflows into something other than itself, in a sense.
By turning them into Taran Miller forever.
Perfect image of the one, which is called the nous.
In a way. So they all think that the
nous
one
is a word in Greek that is basically impossible to translate. And
but I'm actually kind of the chosen one.
The most common translation.
Right, I'm talking to the other ones who are actually kind of the chosen ones too. And I'm like, I don't know which one's more chosen, really. Because we're all told something really incredible about ourselves, right?
Consciousness. None of which.
So, okay, how do I get there? What do I do next? What do I do next? Just keep holding on.
The word nous.
I mean, they'll get there.
The nous is the first
our children mostly
after the one. It's a kind of consciousness.
That's all I'm waiting for. I already got there, basically. Like, I have superpowers and I know it.
The nous is still beyond time and space, so it is a mind that knows all things at the same time, so to say, and in a unified way. All its knowledge is a single thing, right? It's not that it has knowledge of all these separate things in different times. It has knowledge of everything, but that knowledge is a completely unified knowledge of everything in a single eternal instant, you could say. The nous is one.
Might I live there? Probably not. And I was thinking about it, but that's the path to the spirits, and I know
it's even more properly called
there's
one
a trail through
the
there.
actual
might remake
which is, as we said, even beyond the concept of oneness. It is the knower, the known, and the act of knowing all in one, and everything is contained in the nous in complete
Then I will
unity.
fight it.
It is this nous that is the Platonic world of forms, that the archetype of the whole world,
like judgment about God,
beyond temporality and distinction. The nous is being itself. The nous is even God. Now, sometimes Plotinus will refer to the one as God, but more often it is the nous that represents the concept that we associate with God most of the time. So to use more theological or theistic language than Plotinus himself would have been comfortable with, the nous is God, and the forms are God's own thoughts as he knows himself with a knowledge that is identical to himself. This nous not only contemplates itself, but also looks back at the one and contemplates this one, even though this is technically impossible. And as a result of this, another emanation. We move sort of further away from the one as there appears another lesser reality, and this is the soul, or psyche in Greek.
That's when I got
the soul receives the information stored in the intellect and is sort of responsible for taking all that knowledge and making it into actual stuff. Just like the nous looks back at the one its originator, the soul looks back at the nous, its originator,
I've already done over and over and over again.
As a result, it emanates or creates the universe as we know it, the world of
specificity, spring comes.
Things of time and space, which is often referred to as the world of nature.
Pretty much. Well, one time we'll get out there, right? I can really do some crazy shit. I know it.
In the sensible world exist, including our own individual souls. The sensible world is kind of the outer manifestation or imperfect copy of the perfect nous and its contents,
and I know
which is the world of forms. Everything we experience here
see that? See all these flowers? I did that this year, and I know it.
And unified way beyond temporality. So this is a
At Granger, we're for the ones who pay attention to every little detail, the ones who fuss, tinker, and sweat the small stuff. Because you know the tiniest thing can make the biggest difference when it comes to keeping business moving. We get it. We're the same way, offering access to product experts that and easily find what you need. So whatever your industry, you know you're always getting professional-grade products. Call Granger.com and just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
Not get rid of it at any cost.
Temporality. So this is a pretty neat and understandable system, right? It begins at the top with the one, which emanates the nous, which emanates the soul, which in turn emanates or creates the physical world as we know it.
I told you I'm Shiva,
right?
And Poseidon.
In fact, while the outline that I've just given is accurate in a sense, it can also be very misleading and even lead to inaccurate understandings and interpretations of late Platonist physics. For one thing, this whole process of emanation takes place outside of time. When we think of this process of being or becoming, we see it as the one becoming the nous.
Some people straight up not God, they're just fucking here.
But this implies a temporal progression, which is not how it should be understood. Time doesn't exist except in the level below soul in our sensible universe. So this whole process from the one to the nous to the soul is not something that happens, quote unquote, or even has happened. It is a description of the way reality is in eternal,
basically, but I'm primordial, actually.
It recounts an essential structure within reality, not
like no, these are my titans.
It can be pretty tricky to wrap.
I found a couple titans. They're house cats. Shocker, right? House cats' lives are hard. Harder than you think.
In time and
space. Even if sometimes.
Secondly, we describe this process as one thing kind of creating another, and in our minds, we often imagine these realities as being different or separated from each other in some way in a kind of hierarchy. The one is
right, and I was like this magic mountain, and I'm like, okay, well, I have magic powers, and I kind of figured it out.
Far away from each other.
But MK Ultra, blah blah blah, it's a fucking weirder world than you think. Blah 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 blah. Quote unquote spiritual universe.
Right.
And
the nous and the soul. And he's actually pretty strict about this in one way in certain passages.
And we're all doing our thing, and doing our thing, and doing our thing too, all the time.
Forget
they're fucking
attacking
us, like, man,
and instead,
I'm going to kill them to death one day.
Of reality, including these
that piece of shit, no, he fucked me over one time, and I know it.
Within the nous itself, and ultimately within the one itself. This is more of a monistic picture, and the different levels are all a single reality, or a kind of.
But they're using their magic for evil to put you like a death to them, or like their spell book, and like, nope, I'm binding him.
Within each other, but even that is a compromise.
I'm offended. I'm offended.
This process of these hypostases can't really be imagined in a kind of, in the sense of a kind of image or a representation. Really, it is a metaphysical reality. Beyond time and space, so we can't really imagine what it's like. For example, at least according to Plotinus, the human self down here on Earth is not separated from the noetic world, that is the world of the nous, or even from the one, actually. The individual self is in the nous right now and at all times. We are all constantly participating in the nous, and even in the one, we are the nous, and we are the one, even if we don't realize it. So you can see that this neat division into various levels or realities is very misleading, because it is also a deeply integrated system where there is a distinct continuity between the lowest and highest aspects of reality. It's all taking place within itself, so to say. And this is important for another reason, namely that Plotinus's philosophy,
welcome to the primordial waters,
Platonism, is very much performative and participatory.
My name's Taran Miller now.
Nature. It's not just some abstract theoretical philosophy about the way that reality is structured, but also involves the process by which the individual person can realize his true nature, his true self, by climbing up this ladder of existence back from this lower parts of the physical universe and the body all the way back up to the nous. On the human level, Plotinus tells us that we are to turn away from our bodies. Matter is seen as evil in a sense, but only insofar as it becomes an object of desire as opposed to the one or the good. Indeed, to Plotinus, the one is present even in matter itself, and the physical world is a beautiful, yet imperfect, copy of the noetic world of forms. So Plotinus's practical instructions involve a shift of focus from the bodily and material to the intellectual. We are to detach ourselves from the desires of the physical and instead turn towards our higher self, which has its home in the noetic world. In other words, this involves a kind of asceticism.
Some people have a rare blood
not an extreme one, but certainly a way of living that is tempered and controlled.
Magically.
Plotinus himself seems to have lived a rather ascetic life, eating relatively little, and when he did eat, it was exclusively a vegetarian diet.
And I know it now.
Some Neoplatonists have opted to live a life of sexual abstinence altogether, but this was not something required or the norm, really. In general, Plotinus tells us that we are to make the journey inward into the depths of our own selves, and to again turn away from the body and contemplate our true noetic self and the higher realities. How one does this on a more concrete level is hard to say.
Some have saved them in a way
that Plotinus may have performed some meditation practice and taught this kind of practice to students, but this is uncertain and mostly speculation. It seems pretty certain that it involves some sort of inward traveling, right? Of traveling inwards into the soul and the depths of the self, and through that sort of ascend higher into the noetic and the intellectual worlds. And when she does that, she can realize her true home in the nous, and in a sense, even become united with the nous, or more accurately, to realize that she was the nous the entire time. Furthermore, Plotinus even seems to indicate that we become mystically united with the one itself, to experience a flight of the alone
more like that,
or a solitary in the solitary, as Plotinus says himself in the very final words of the Enneads. You can perhaps see why many have chosen to call Plotinus a mystic when they take all these aspects into account.
Who is smelling their food more when they're eating
mystic
it and
and
chewing it
mysticism
slower?
are, of course, debated and problematic in some way, but I think it's important to recognize and consider this very participatory aspect.
Who's smoking a little bit more than they did before? Is it doing you bad, or is it doing you all right, if you do it right?
Like I said, it's not only about the structure of reality in a theoretical sense, but the human journey back to her higher essence, a kind of spiritual self-realization and ascent back to the
doing the right stuff.
There's a bi-directional progression. Everything flows from the one and ultimately returns
like some
back
people smoke sage,
inhaling.
Maybe you just like incense. That can do
this
it
language
too.
And imagery has become some of the most influential and
so that is recommended if you don't want to be a smoker. That's fine.
Mysticism.
You like the way you breathe. That's fair.
And spiritual traditions.
Try incense.
Since then, this motion of flowing out and returning is a core feature.
No, those fucking Febreze and shit. Nah. Burn some herbs in your house.
This outer bodily form is only a fleeting temporary shell. The world isn't inherently negative, though. Indeed, Plotinus has a whole treatise in the Enneads called Against the Gnostics, where it basically tears this group of early Christians apart. Very basically, they believe that the physical world was created by an evil demiurge.
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I don't really have the ingredients all the time.
Basically, all of the world is a kind of negative prison. And Plotinus did not agree with this idea. He does not have as negative of a view of the physical world and of creation as such. And so he dedicates this treatise in the Enneads to completely refuting the Gnostics.
See, no, not that smell.
Very hard.
See, there's a weird funky smell around here right now.
Copy of
I know it's toxic mold going around.
In perfect way.
But I don't know what the source is.
Contains everything that is and ever will be in this world, but in a non-temporal and perfect way. We are experiencing that world in an imperfect way through the mediation of time and space. And at the same time, we also saw everything takes place.
But the wind punishes people for a reason around here.
In the nous right now and having these experiences inside the noetic world. This is a worldview that is fundamentally different from the modern one most of us hold,
and I know it.
We conceive of a real external world.
No, it's weird, because we're on the west coast, that's the east wind that whips through here.
The Neoplatonic view is sort of the other way around.
Mostly.
There isn't a real external world in which there are minds. The external world is in fact within mind, within nous or consciousness. It's not that
I think the biggest problem heading northeast.
Boom. As we commonly understand that phrase, but simply that mind
like
or
right
nous
up
is
mountain
the
direction,
prior
almost.
principle. It
It
is consciousness or nous that is real, and the external world unfolds within that consciousness. But there is still a kind of
why is there not a study on that?
Physical
Because some of the heaviest ones I've ever fucking felt are right here, in California, and I fucking know it.
Plotinus and the other Neoplatonists put such an emphasis on leaving the body, right, of ascending back towards the higher world, or I should say the higher aspect of the world or reality, because, like I said, it's all a single continuum.
Except for maybe on the ocean.
Here's another good opportunity to stop and dispel some possible misunderstandings and sort of wrong ways of imagining this stuff. When we say that the soul leaves the body and travels up into the higher
unless you've been in a hurricane.
One tendency to imagine this is to think of the soul
or a tornado
leaving the body and somehow
there have been here. No, I summoned one.
All the way up
a tornado.
That is not how this should be understood. This whole journey, the journey of the soul into the higher realms, all of it takes place
almost
inside oneself. Right, it's a journey inward, not upward into
almost
heavenly world. Right, it's a
I'm summoning dust devils.
The depths of
right over George's grave a few times
because it is there inside ourselves.
Yes, I'm talking about. No, that's what I'm talking about.
That is where the nous.
Few people remember that shit. They're like, whoa, no way, right? Right.
It is within us that this entire cosmos exists, from nature to soul to nous. Remember, we are we are the nous. So the entire
we are the nous,
including knowledge of all things and the whole of reality, exists within the self. There are depths to the self that very few people have any idea of. And this journey of ascent is the process of realizing this aspect of yourself. This is what Plotinus refers to as the undescended soul, or the undescended self. But there is a true part of ourselves that is always in the nous.
I think you are too. So the fuck with this guy, Plotinus.
Quote, the fact is that even our own soul does not descend in its entirety, but there is something of it always in the intelligible world. However, if that part which is in the sensible world
all of philosophy is just footnotes to Plato.
If it is dominated and subjected to disturbance, it does not permit there to be
forwards and backwards. I'm like, well, it's footnotes to Thales at least.
Part of the soul is in
that always makes more sense to me. Footnotes to Thales, because he was right all the way back then. Weird fucking ways, turns out.
But it should be pointed out that many later Neoplatonists, indeed some of the most prominent ones like Iamblichus and Proclus, all completely disagreed with him on this.
The way I saw it back then was so different to the way I see it now.
Entirely rejected by
the guy had no idea what I was talking about.
Once one lets go of all fetters of physical body and existence and
somehow he's
into
saying,
the depths
no, you did more than we do now.
The human becomes united with the nous. Plotinus himself very famously describes the experience of this journey from the body and the bafflement of having actually returned from the non-temporal noetic experience of the absolute back to his regular old body and individual consciousness. He says, quote, often, after waking up to myself from the body, that is, externalizing myself in relation to all other things, while entering into myself, I behold the beauty of wondrous
evil asshole by
my believe then that I'm most to be identified with my better part,
but not really,
that I enjoy the best quality of life and have become united with the divine and situated within it, actualizing myself at that level and situating myself above all else in the intelligible world. Following on this recourse within the divine and descending from intellect into acts of calculative reasoning, I ask myself in bewilderment, how on earth did I ever come down here? And however did my soul come to be enclosed in a body, being such as it has revealed itself to be, even while in the body?
Their families,
this return seems to be the highest experience or state that a person can strive towards. But Plotinus sometimes goes even further and suggests that the person can even become the one itself. This is a very complicated topic, and Plotinus doesn't talk about it as much as he does about the nous, primarily because, well, it can't be talked about. In fact, an experience of becoming the one or mystically uniting with the one is not an experience at all. It's beyond even experience. The one is, after all, covered by an absolute apophatic darkness. Nothing can be said about it. It lies in the utter darkness of unsaying and unknowing, beyond things like understanding, description, or even experience, as we saw. The way that Plotinus approaches describing or talking about the one in the Enneads is absolutely incredible. It's a sort of exercise in trying to explain something that cannot be explained.
In the ancient world, people were drunk all the time.
Radical and amazing examples of apophatic philosophy and expression in history. He will describe the one in a certain way in multiple passages, and then later on completely contradict himself. The one is one.
I fucking know it.
The one is not one.
The one is free, and
then the one is not free.
No, the logic is different.
What is so fascinating about this approach is that it isn't necessarily descriptive at all. That is, Plotinus is not describing anything about the one for us because such a thing cannot be achieved. Instead, it's a kind of participatory process. What does this mean? Well, when Plotinus describes or describes the one, he's taking a journey or a kind of exercise. He doesn't give us any actual descriptions of the one, but gives us paradoxical statements. The one is this.
He never really feels bad.
The one is not bad. He's helping us collapse all
I'm the bad guy, letting you guys' minds, and I know it.
And reminding any way that we can conceptualize the topic in our head. Until there is nothing left but our own unknowing or ignorance. And it is there, in that unknowing darkness, that we maybe get a glimpse of what the one
your business
entails.
models.
It's crazy stuff. And it is this one that we can...
How dare you dare not?
We've already explored
no
the fact that
bastard,
everything kind of takes place within the one, and everything partakes of the one. Although this is another one of those
bad neighbor.
The one is everything and everywhere, but it is also
have a lot of money.
Utterly beyond anything. Quote, it is because the one is omnipresent.
At least in comparison.
There is nowhere where it is not. And so it fills everything.
Which everyone
and
does,
so it is
pretty
in
much.
many, or rather, it is already all things. For if it itself were
you
everywhere,
your cat's
it
over
would
your
be
dad.
everything. But since it is also nowhere, while all things come to be due to it because it is everywhere,
spiritual,
they are other than it because it is nowhere. And another quote, the one is outside nothing, but it has intercourse with all things. Indeed, this apophatic way of talking about the one, of postulating that the very fundamental aspect of reality
choose your soul over your body,
understood or grasped or described in any kind of way, would be incredibly influential on the theologians and philosophers of the monotheistic religions, so thinkers from the Islamic, Christian, and Jewish religions. And so would play a major role
I skipped church
in
today,
the
not on
vocabulary
purpose.
and symbolism of the theologies and mysticisms, maybe, of all those religions. In any case, Plotinus indicates that we can become the one, to be
Can I rush there? Yeah.
with it.
I
It's
feel like
something that is
it's whatever.
exceedingly rare, but it can be done by the most accomplished of souls. Plotinus himself has obviously had this experience, or should I say non-experience.
Trust me, I got time.
In fact, Porphyry tells us in his biography that Plotinus experienced this highest state on 4 occasions while he was with him. Quote, so it is that this divine daimon of a man ascended in his thought to the first transcendent God many times, traveling the roads described by Plato in the Symposium, and to him appeared that God who has neither shape nor form, who has his seat above intellect and every intelligible thing. I, Porphyry, now 67 years old, once drew near this God and was unified with him. Anyway, the goal appeared near Plotinus. His aim or goal was to be unified and to be present to the God that is set over all things. This goal, an indescribable state of perfection, he achieved some 4 times while I was with him.
You know, we're working the whole fucking time.
When we read sections from the Enneads that talk about this,
get these cats back and train them.
It seems pretty clear that he's speaking from first-hand experience. Quote, on actually ascending to this and becoming this alone, casting aside all else, what could we say about it except that we are more than free and have more than autonomy? Who would connect us with chance events, either random or due to an accidental attribute, once we have become the true life itself, or having come to be in it, which contains nothing else, but is just itself? What
else would you be doing mostly
with the one like? Well, since the one cannot be described in any way,
in the wintertime,
obviously,
hanging out with me, I know it.
To be that one is equally impossible. It involves a total disappearance of the self and everything associated with it. To be mystically united with the nous is one thing, and that is a very high achievement indeed, where we become what we already were. But it seems that even in that moment of union with the one,
there's a guy.
The place
there he
is not
I know that guy.
And without division.
Yeah, that's my guy right there.
Some kind of individuality. even though she has become pure knowing herself through a knowledge that is herself, beyond any subject-object dichotomy.
I like the guy too.
There's still some
No, the
kind
God
of
guy.
individuality,
I know him.
or rather, there is still something. But when the person wishes to achieve mystical union with the One, she has to reach even beyond the noetic, to the total darkness and nothingness.
Man, one of them's like, man, no, check it out.
She has to completely shed any sense of herself, even the noetic,
you can be a dick,
until she is utterly nothing. When she is, quote,
no, he has
alone
a demon with him.
With the alone.
This cat.
Quote, it is just like those who are sent to partake of the sacred religious rites, where there are acts of purification and the stripping off of
no,
the
he's a sneaky demon
before they go inside naked. One proceeds in
no,
the
he seems nice and he seems nice and he seems nice
to the God,
and then Garfield just scratches you right in the fucking face, and you're like, why did you do that? Ow.
Simple and pure, that upon which everything depends, and in relation to which one looks,
I would not do that,
and lives and thinks. There can be nothing with the One, because the One is nothing. It's no thing. In a sense, we cannot unite with the One at all. Instead, we shed everything until we are nothing, and in that nothing is only the One. So we aren't the One. The One is simply itself. It just is. So this uniting, unbecoming the One, is not an experience. It cannot possibly be an experience because there is nothing.
Because it's
there
judgmental.
is no one to have an experience and nothing to experience.
Get the reputation because they
There's
think it's
just the One being what it is in its utter apophatic darkness. Quote, perhaps one can argue that one should not say one will see and the thing seen, if indeed one should say that there are two things, the seer and the seen, and that both are not one. This argument is indeed rash. For at the time of union, this seeing self neither sees nor discerns, nor imagines two things, but has in a way become another, and not oneself, nor does one belong to oneself in the intelligible world.
Or them
one has come to belong to the good, and has become one.
Well, you're insane. You're insane.
Point.
You're
and
not.
That is the absolute highest achievement and experience, or non-experience, that we can have. And it's accompanied by a kind of
and I fucking know
bliss, at least in the moments after, since when you are the One, you are not experiencing anything, including bliss. It is even described in erotic ways, with the person being a lover seeking out her beloved in passion.
This is called ecstasy.
Which obviously reminds us a lot of later expressions in traditions like Sufism. So now we've kind of made the whole journey. We started with the One and saw how reality unfolded and flowed from this
basically
all the way down to our individual souls and even matter itself, although that is a very complicated topic, as we saw. And now we've also made that journey back
at 26
from the
years
individual
old
self to our true home in the noetic world, and even in a kind of mystical union with the
and I kind of know it.
The outgoing and ingoing from the One.
All right, 516. All right, no more of that.
Exhaling of the breath, to use the language of the Sufi Ibn Arabi.
But I've never been trained.
This is an episode about Neoplatonism,
ever.
After all, and we really only focused on Plotinus here. He is a very significant figure, perhaps the most significant figure in that tradition, since he's considered a kind of founder, or at least the most important systematizer of that particular school of thought. But there's, of course, a lot more to Neoplatonism than just Plotinus. Because while his successors would look to him as a great authority and base their ideas on some of the most general features of his system, the later Neoplatonists would forge their own ways of looking at the world, in which they could sometimes differ dramatically and fundamentally from Plotinus. He was succeeded by people like Porphyry, who was a close student who we already met, and this guy kind of stuck pretty close to the teachings of his master. He was, though, a little more interested in what we could call religion. So Plotinus in general used language that wasn't really outright religious at all. I'm sure he believed in the gods in some way, and he does refer to the nous and sometimes the One as God, or Theos in singular, but he doesn't really seem bothered with fitting the religious system of his culture into his philosophy. Indeed, we saw in the
biography. That's why your animals love you like that.
The gods should come to
Part
him
one.
rather than the other.
So why don't you love them like that?
Porphyry,
the origin of daylight,
was a little more interested
Who the fuck are you?
modification of the
and
Tlingit
incorporated
legend.
that somewhat
Do
more
not.
into his thought.
When the earth
But
was
this
very
religious
new and
aspect
young,
really
it was
starts to
dark and
flourish
cold
with the
and
later
gray.
components of Neoplatonism,
Even the
I do.
stars
such
were
as
black.
Iamblichus and
There was
Proclus,
no light
where these
anywhere.
known as theurgy.
I'll convert the enemy if I have to.
Topic of its own, but which tries to call upon the gods through rituals, often with the purpose of elevating oneself. So unlike Plotinus, who believed that we are in the nous and that we can make the
For
journey
gold,
to
kept it in a small box.
And I know it.
Carefully.
The dogs.
Like Iamblichus believe that we actually need the help of the gods to achieve this.
Working on it, have been.
And he describes theurgic rituals to achieve such a salvation. The gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon were often seen as being personifications of different aspects of the world, for instance.
He wished for the day
in the kind of people like Iamblichus and Proclus. That's unlike Plotinus, who keeps his philosophy sort of separates some degree from religion in that sense, even though, of course, he uses words like God, and it's obviously influenced by some degree.
Had be
like Iamblichus and Proclus.
One day,
that
when
was
Gold and
much
Raven
more
were out
into
walking, Raven
different
thought,
gods become different aspects
Oh, man.
in the Roman context is identified with the nous as a whole, and then all the different aspects of the nous are the other gods, which are kind of aspects of Zeus as the highest god. So they fit the pantheon and the religious mythology into this Neoplatonic system in a very kind of
Neoplatonism.
impressive way a lot of the time. In general, the later Neoplatonists are much more systematic.
Neoplatonism is correct, which is what Christianity is based on.
From reading the Enneads, we can see that Plotinus probably has a kind of system in mind, but it's very hard to make out the details of this system because the Enneads are very difficult. They are very messy, partly because of Porphyry's ordering of the Enneads.
If you understand Neoplatonism,
how they are written
then you
themselves
understand that.
are a lot more. They're not as clear and systematic, let's just say, compared to someone like Proclus. In his
Proclus was right, pretty much. Sorry, Garfield. And he fucking knew it. We knew it. He knew I work with the gods all the time. All of them. With Pseudo Dionysius as well, who was a Christian. And his name was Dionysius the Areopagite. And he knew why. He wasn't stupid. No, you're stupid. No, you're stupid. I'm not stupid. I understand that now. My cat couldn't meow.
Elements of theology, Proclus presents a much more systematic and elegant structure of the Neoplatonic worldview. But in these systems, we often see a stark contrast to Plotinus. While Plotinus' system is relatively simple, he likes to identify various aspects of reality with each other and in a unified sense. Those of people like Iamblichus, Proclus, and others are often a lot
I get
more
it now,
complex.
but it's like to be a cat.
Whereas Plotinus had a very simple one nous soul structure, Iamblichus argues for various levels of the one as well as multiple intellects or nouses. The one has three aspects, for example, and the lowest aspect of the one is the highest aspect of the nous, and then the nous has three aspects of its own, and the lowest part of that is, and he just, every part of those parts has parts in themselves. So he and Proclus, for example, really builds the system into a much more complex picture, many more parts and aspects.
You know, I really thought about this one time. Himself, I know I'm not stupid. I got where I'm at for a reason.
Simple and consciously so. He actually
I get distracted.
very much criticized other metaphysical
systems
that made everything way too complex.
Ever.
He kept it very simple as a principle.
A good life? No, never.
Later Neoplatonists, as we
Always
see,
learning.
Had a much different approach.
Trying to.
There's a metaphysics that has a lot more
magical warfare with these fucking
are
animals.
much more independent.
Most
of the later Neoplatonists would reject Plotinus' idea of the undescended self, for example, where, as we saw, an aspect of the self is always in the nous. These later thinkers instead arguing for a reality where the different parts of the world or of reality are much more strictly separated from each other. The human aspect can never leave the human realm as such, because there is a much more stark border between the levels, and instead requires other means of achieving ascended
George
states,
can still learn.
such as through the help of the gods, for example, through theurgic rituals. So this creates a pretty confusing
Be a
picture.
fucking human.
While the Neoplatonists in general are seen as belonging to a single school, which goes back to Plotinus and ultimately to Plato, there's a huge diversity in the different ideas that individual members of this school had. As we saw in the beginning, calling
Now,
it a school
Garfield
at
told me
all
that
can
George's
be
a big
problematic,
talker.
and
He
it
was
should
talking all
probably
the
rather
time.
be seen as a kind
No,
of
in English,
loose,
clearly.
late antique
You just couldn't
tendency
hear him,
within
Dad, and you were
Platonist
claiming
thought.
it was yours.
So how
Like,
can we
I know
define
it. No, I know
Neoplatonism
it.
at all? Well, despite these differences,
How's that
there are
true
few
about
things
smart
that
the whole time?
unify
You weren't that kind of
Neoplatonism
smart,
as a
and I
coherent
kind of know it.
philosophy,
Like,
and which
Exhibition sharing minds, I
characterizes
taught him a lot of it, I
later
believe.
developments that it influenced. Neoplatonism in general holds to the idea of the hypostases, the levels
Well,
of
really,
reality,
really good
which
ideas, I know
generally
it.
follow the same outline. There's the one, followed by the nous, followed by the soul, followed by nature and the physical world. While the different thinkers would postulate nuances to this, various intellects or steps along the way,
Made sense
the
back
general
then. To me, it
outline
did.
is recurring in
Still does.
basically
Even if it
all
never
of
made sense to you, and I
Neoplatonism.
see why.
Similarly, another
Now I
recurring
do.
theme is the apophatic
But you're
nature
fucking
of
weird.
the one, or
To
of the
me.
most fundamental aspect of reality. The idea that the one is hidden in an absolute darkness of unknowing beyond understanding or explanation. We
You
also see
love differently
characteristics
than
such as
that.
these different realities emanating out from each other, that the one emanates the
You
nous,
love
which
differently than
emanates
I
the
do.
soul, and so on. Now, as
You don't love
metaphorical
as much
as this
as I
we
do.
talked about
So
here
you're
today.
fucking weird to
So when
me.
you see these features that I've just described in later religious schools or philosophies, you'll be able to recognize them as very characteristically Neoplatonic. Because indeed, as we said at the beginning, Neoplatonism has been one of the most influential philosophical movements in history that has played a key role in the development of Christian, Islamic, and Jewish theology and mysticism, as well as influencing Western esotericism, occultism, as I said in the beginning, also all of what we call Western thought in general. It influenced some of the earliest Christian theologians, such as Pseudo Dionysius, whose apophatic theology expressed in works like the Mystical Theology is strongly Plotinian and Proclean in nature. One of the great figures and teachings of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and figures in the West like Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa, just to mention a few. In the Islamic world, Neoplatonism and the works of Plotinus became one of the defining factors in the tradition of Falsafa and Kalam, and influenced such figures as Ibn Sina or Avicenna, Fakhruddin al-Razi, and the Sufi metaphysics of figures such as Ibn Arabi and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Similarly, in the Jewish world, Neoplatonism played a major role in the emergence of various forms of Jewish philosophy and mysticism, including, of course, Kabbalah. Indeed, that topic of mysticism is significant because so much of what we understand as mysticism can be traced directly to Neoplatonism. From the apophatic language that is used to the emphasis on the soul's stripping of worldliness and returning to a pure world of mind, and to be mystically united with the one at the core of reality. It's some of the most common language in the history
You're
of
burning in hell now.
mysticism,
You
even if
thought
that
that was
word should
interesting?
be used carefully. In other words, we owe a whole lot to these guys and their fascinating ideas. And that is why it's so amazing that we're doing this large collaboration here on YouTube. My
Don't say
colleagues,
the N-word
Debbie from
anymore.
Seekers of Unity, Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica, Dr. Angela Puka, Angela Symposium, Dana Trell from The Modern Hermeticist, and John
Either black
Vervaeke,
people
from his channel John Vervaeke,
or Africans.
all making videos about Neoplatonism and its influence and relationship with different aspects of intellectual history. So be sure to check out all of those amazing episodes. I'll be making 2 of them. Zebi is making 3, I believe. My next video in particular is going to be about Neoplatonism and Islamic thought.
Because there are some black beings out there that are actually colored black.
Next week, but also definitely check out the other videos or episodes.
No,
they're going to be amazing. I've seen the episodes and they're absolutely incredible. I'm so happy and honored to be part of this incredible project to bring one of the most influential and important philosophical traditions
That's all I have to say about that.
A wider audience here on YouTube. Again, I'm truly honored and so great to call these people.
They might take that one a little offensively, but not really, not really.
And I look forward to
You're brown and I'm white, I know it.
Many such similar projects and collaborations in the future. For now, this will have to do for an admittedly inadequate and incomplete introduction to the vast world of Neoplatonism.
Back in the day, to some white people, that meant a lot of things.
Primarily on Plotinus here, who is the perhaps the central figure, but we've also seen how this school and this
That's
tradition
amazing.
is much
You're
broader
basically
than
a
that.
white person as
We've
far as
also
I'm
touched
concerned.
on some of the other significant
priorities.
thinkers from that school. Still, we've been introduced to some of the core features and most important aspects and tendencies of this amazing philosophical tradition, which will help us better spot the places where it shows its beautiful face in the history of intellectual thought and even today. I'll see you next time.
How spiritual are you? Are you a spiritual fucking warrior? You know it? You do, huh? Are you a female soldier in the Middle East who doesn't die no matter what? What about in Africa? What about in the heart of Africa? Or sometimes even worse. And we kind of know it. We forget about it. But I don't. Turns out, some of those people are pretty fucking magical. If they got there. We need to help them. If we help them, and they helped us back, spiritually, we'd all feel a lot better. Oh, you're fucking retarded, huh? Basically. Because I can't beg for money. Or fill out an application. Completely. What about Shiva? What do you know about Shiva? No, I know about Shiva. I know about love. I figured it out. It was really interesting. Now, coming from the East, the true East mostly, for me, but the West too in a way. I'm assuming it's the way the wind works around here. But who knows, right? What's the largest pagan religion? Technically, Hinduism. Which basically includes Christianity just fine. Now, the Hindus already figured this out. There are books on it. Big old ones. Very much. You want to do medicine? Not a big medicine person if you can help it. Yeah, me too, pretty much. I understand that. Sometimes we should, though. Just be intelligent. Just look it up. And use your intuition. But not too much. You know what I mean? Be judicious. Look at the human body and say, okay, what can I be missing? What do I need?
We find ourselves
And that's for that.
in a curious situation in the current world.
Let's look at a commercial and say,
In
yeah, I
some
want some of
parts of
that.
the world, especially in secularized Europe, being religious is sometimes seen as something rather embarrassing, something irrational. Religion generally is seen as often being dangerous or opposed to modern ideas.
They kind of tell you to. But they don't really let you. You got to be kind of pushy. I noticed that. Is that on purpose?
But
yes,
at
it
the
is
same
sometimes, and we kind of know it.
People also love to call themselves spiritual. The term "I am spiritual but not religious" is a very common term in many of these contexts. The bulk of our skepticism towards religion is usually aimed at or towards Christianity. To the majority of people in Europe, for example, Christianity is the religion by which other religions are measured. Christianity is the religion by which other religions are measured. So
if you can't fit Christianity within your religion, then I think you're wrong.
What religion is supposed to be. In that sense, Christianity often comes to represent something old and outdated, something
but the thing goes for Christianity
silly
and
beliefs
Buddhism.
In some man in the sky who watches
and not
over
just
us.
Like, yeah,
and by contrast,
no, like full on Hindu Buddhism.
Many of the religions
Vajrayana Buddhism, basically.
So we say Hinduism or Buddhism and these kinds of religions are viewed in a very different light in the Western world in Europe. This is partly the result of a very shallow understanding of the Christian tradition and a romanticizing of the more exotic religions.
Well, we knew it was a polytheistic world.
Many of the theological critiques aimed at Christianity, like, for example, the idea that they believe in some man in the sky, is often more based on.
And we said, don't. They said, but no other God before me.
Christian
for
theology.
A reason.
The intellectual tradition of
dangerous.
Christian theology and mysticism is a broad, deep, and complex one. And a lot of it would probably be very intellectually stimulating to those who were willing to actually look a bit deeper rather than through very shallow pop culture infused misrepresentations. In fact, many of those ideas and philosophies that are so appealing to many people in the Eastern religions are usually very much present in the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity. In Christian mysticism, for example, we find many striking similarities with teachings from Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, Sufism, and some forms of Taoism. And this is why I want to dedicate this video to one of the most fascinating thinkers, mystics, and philosophers in European and Christian history, the Dominican friar from Germany, the man from whom God hid nothing, Meister Eckhart. This video is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon community, and as always, I'm going to be mentioning some of the new arrivals to our Patreon team. I would like to thank Danny van Heck, Ateris Fries, George Askunis. I would like to thank also Carl Taps. I would like to thank Mats Orman, Simulation, Mo S, and Marilyn Zahra Berger. And a special thank you to our group of saints, Wasif Khan, Greg Corbin, Adam Shreibi, Wael Mohammed, Hanan Fikri, Saeed Jafari, and Amu Latif. Without all of you, this channel would not be possible, so I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so much. I will leave a link to my Patreon page in the description if anyone else wants to join our little community. Eckhart von Hochheim is one of the most cool expressions of oneness with God, and also a list of devoted admirers and followers. Eckhart was born in Germany near the city of Gotha in around the year 1260. His earliest years are quite obscure, but we know that he probably entered the Dominican order in early adulthood and became a friar. In these monastic orders of Christianity, the difference between a friar and a monk is that a monk lives in a cloistered community that is isolated from the world, whereas a friar will take all the vows of celibacy and poverty while still living within his. And indeed, the first time Meister Eckhart appears in the historical record is in 1294, when he holds an Easter sermon in Paris as a junior professor. Only one instance that shows Meister Eckhart's very active and distinguished career as a teacher and preacher in different convents and in different universities. As a young Dominican, he would study theology and philosophy, perhaps under Albert the Great in Cologne. He seems to have been strongly influenced by Albert as well as Thomas Aquinas, both of whom were his older contemporaries. The Dominican order at this time was characterized by a strong scholasticism and thereby a big emphasis on philosophyology more broadly. They were especially influenced by the Greek philosopher Aristotle and studied many of his works along with his Muslim and Arab Ibn Rushd or Averroes. To the Dominicans, rational philosophy was an important part in understanding them from the other major order at the time, the Franciscans, who were often highly critical of using Aristotelian philosophy. At this time, this was in fact a huge debate in the Christian world. These two opposing sides, which are often represented by the Dominican order on the one hand and the Franciscan order on the other, often argued about the compatibility of philosophy and theology or revelation. Meister Eckhart, naturally, since he was a Dominican, argued very much in favor of the use of philosophy and Aristotelianism. When we read his works and his sermons, we can clearly see very strong use and influence from the Aristotelian tradition. This is at the core of Meister Eckhart's ideas. As a teacher of theology and philosophy, we know that Eckhart
how advanced are they? The medical companies?
The works of Peter Lombard in Paris.
You'd be fucking sickly surprised, dude.
And after this, he would spend his time moving around a lot between different cities in the region for basically the rest of his life, being appointed to different positions of authority. A large portion of his life was spent in a convent in the city Erfurt, which is often considered his home convent. This is where he spent most of his time. He would preach here to other monks.
There's some even fucking torture people in the
Dominican order. He would write many of his commentaries on the Bible and so on. In the year 1302, Eckhart returned to Paris, being appointed the Regent Master, which is the highest teaching position.
The Earth's best thing is a little different, but they're related, guys. Trust me.
With a teaching
and I kind of know it.
Only a year later, and between the years 1303 to 1311, he served as provincial, that is, the Dominican authority over the entire province of Saxonia, which is eastern and northern Germany. He was very successful here as well, founding a few convents.
Even that technology's out, and you can do weapons as well for a while.
Within the Dominican order. After this, he returned once again to Paris to serve a second term as regent master, this time for 2 years, before relocating
The worst
to
weapons
Salzburg
of mass
in
destruction
1313,
ever made
and
are just in the
finally to
hands
the city
of
of
fucking
Cologne
crazy
in either
civilians sometimes.
1323 or 1324,
And some of them we
where
don't
he
even know
spent
exist,
his last
technically.
years. All of this to show you that Eckhart was no controversial mystic on the fringes of society or the church, at least for most of his life. He was a very successful and reputable man within the Dominican order, and also through that in the church.
Whack ass
generally.
civilians.
In all his time
Rich.
moving around
He was
from
pretty
different
smart.
cities, he wrote many
And rich enough.
literary works, primarily in Latin. Much of this corpus of his writings consists of Latin works that are
He
mostly
was lucky.
commentaries, so philosophical commentaries on certain books of the Bible. These Latin works of prose are fascinating and interesting enough in themselves, but it wasn't here he left his biggest mark on history. Indeed, Eckhart was a magnificent
They
preacher,
thought at least.
and he preached a lot. He preached
You
in
think-
convents and universities, but he
Okay,
also
what's
preached
next?
to the
Take your
general
heart out.
masses around
Howard.
Germany. And in these sermons, he used the vernacular language of
This world
Middle
could be way
High
harder playing
German.
that game
That
now.
is the language
this fucking
spoken
world,
by
or
the
it gets out,
regular people.
It's out there.
Indeed,
It's
this
in
was
the
a
water
time
already.
when the German language had begun to
Somebody
be
turned this
used
story already.
in a religious way, primarily
No,
by
they-
some of the women mystics of the region, like the Beguines,
There are
for
people like
example. Now, Eckhart, of course, picks up on this general trend in the region and uses his
You know, it's a better
native
idea
language
than
of
not.
German to get very creative linguistically and create some truly awe-inspiring imagery
next
and
then?
phrases. Many of Eckhart's sermons
Well,
survive
improve
in
it.
written form, and they make up the bulk of what has made him
I
so
already have a camera for you.
controversial,
Sure.
but also so beloved
Some
at
of
the
it at
same
least.
time. The use of the vernacular
it, no,
language allowed
but I
Eckhart
will.
to create a very emotional and vibrant way of talking about, among many other
Financially.
things. This is
Let me guess.
somewhat established theological language of Latin, does not come off as creative and as striking, but these sermons, along with some of his Latin treatises as well, did get him into some trouble. Indeed, by the end of his life, he was actually tried for heresy by the Pope John the 22nd. Certain sections from his writings and sermons were dangerous, and he had to defend himself, both in person and in written form. In any case, this was, of course, a long process. There was an investigation. Eckhart had to defend himself in trials and so on. This process was so long, in fact, that before it even ended, Eckhart had already died. We're not entirely sure how or when Eckhart died, but scholars suggest that he probably died of natural causes. He was pretty old at this time, and that it may have been on January 28th, 1328. As the investigation against Eckhart concluded after he died, he was not actually deemed a heretic.
What kind of things are you talking about?
Opposed to what many people tend to say when they talk about this. Instead, 28 parts or 28 sections from his writings or sermons were picked out and deemed as either heretical or as dangerous, which indeed did leave a kind of black mark on his reputation for some time afterwards. But this did not stop him, of course, from being immensely popular and as having many devoted followers and students. And today, he is generally accepted as a great teacher within the Catholic Church. But now it's time to get into the meat of the discussion. What were these ideas that were so powerful and controversial? What did he say in his sermons and his written works? Now, Eckhart can be a seriously difficult thinker, and there's often disagreement on how he should.
No, I know that.
One of the foremost scholars
trust me.
of Eckhart today, Bernard McGinn, has argued that if Eckhart's teachings or ideas can be summarized under one phrase or name,
I know that I
it would
have.
be the mysticism
My
of the
intention.
ground. The ground is, in fact, one of the central
Almost right
themes
there.
in all of his
Killed somebody.
sermons, and a concept which
I didn't care
everything
at all.
else revolves around.
Pretty much.
The original word which Eckhart uses is the German Grund, which is, as we have seen, translated as ground,
But I did
in
revive
fact can
them,
have a
too.
much broader and more creative use in its original German form. In the words of McGinn, quote, Grund can first of all be understood as physical ground, that is the earth. Grund can also mean the bottom or lowest side of a body, surface, or structure. Abstractly, Grund is employed to indicate the origin, cause, beginning, reason, or proof of something. Finally, Grund is employed as what is inmost, hidden, and most proper to a being, that is, its essence. In some ways, this is quite different from how the word ground usually functions in English, and thus the German word Grund gives Eckhart the opportunity to play around a lot with terms and concepts. But in any case, the way Eckhart uses the word Grund is to signify a radical and striking point about the nature of reality. To the Dominican master, the ground of the soul and the ground of God is one and the same ground. In fact, in a lot of his sermons and writings, he talks about the ground in an indistinct, the ground of the soul, because when he talks about the ground, there is no distinction between these two. Quotes, "It is not because either the soul is grounded in its essential reality or God in his, but because they are both grounded in the same ground, in a fused identity, that Eckhart and his followers found the language of the ground so rich in meaning." The ground or Grund is a metaphor that describes the very zenith or center of reality or of the divine.
Like, what are they
It is
talking about?
incomprehensible, beyond all being or language or particularity. It is God,
It is God.
but it is also beyond God. What I mean by
I'm not
that is
God.
that it is beyond God as we commonly understand God. It is beyond the Trinity of the Christian
The
theology
Godhead.
or even the oneness of God itself. But it nonetheless is God in God's absolute and essential reality. The ground is utterly the silent and empty abyss, which in German is
Silent and empty
Abgrund,
abyss.
by the way.
I kind of
That
know
is
it.
the true essence of the Godhead.
The true essence.
It is the
The Godhead.
starting point of reality, from which everything, including divinity, emanates, and to which everything eventually
everything
flows
which-
back.
Including
And
divinity,
in the
emanates
Grund,
from
there's no distinction.
the
The
source.
soul and God, everything is absolutely indistinct from
It's like
each
back
other.
to source when you
They are
die. Not
fundamentally
even, dude. Not
one.
even.
Eckhart himself puts it in very plain words. Quote, "God's ground and the soul's ground is one ground." And, quote, "Here God's ground is
Is that
my
I told you on
ground,
your trip?
and my ground is God's ground." Now, this sounds radical, of course, and to some it may appear to go against
No, NDEs
perceived
are real.
as
Near-death
Christian
experiences are very
orthodoxy.
real.
But Eckhart insisted that this is an essential feature of Christianity and the divine word. Quote, "Now know all of our perfection and our holiness rests in this, that a person must penetrate and
I don't know,
transcend
buddy, but
everything
they
created
basically
and
are, guys.
temporal and all being and go into the ground that has no ground. We pray our dear Lord God that we may become one and indwelling." As this section suggests, the ultimate goal is to penetrate back into God, to detach from the world of particularities and individualism and
People
return
find
back
the
to
spirituality,
our
I'm like, no, it's
source.
fucking religion.
And eventually, the further
Like, what
we
religion?
reach, even
Perennialism.
God himself will unbecome, as, quote, "The mystic
God.
is not content to return to the God who
Perennial blooming
acts,
flower,
but
religion.
effects a
They're
breaking
starting to
through
stretch you
to the
apart.
silent, unmoving Godhead." As we break
Religion.
through, we reach beyond the God as commonly perceived, beyond the Trinity, and enter into the silent, empty desert of the ground.
When you go
the
beyond the
Grund,
Trinity,
where God and human achieves indistinct
right to the ground
identity
and find
in
them
the
all.
simple one. But
Back to
this
the one.
indistinction and oneness is always there. It is not that the mystic becomes one with God, but realizes his already essential oneness. Of course, many Christian mystics and thinkers prior
Find out
to
who you
Eckhart
are
have
now.
also talked about uniting with God. But in most cases, this was referring to a kind of
It might be
intimacy
a
with
mission
God,
to
as being
find out who you
one with
really
God in spirit, and not necessarily a complete
I'm not there
identity
yet.
between the two. But this indeed seems to be what Eckhart is indicating. The closest we find to Eckhart's expressions is in the Christian mystic women of the 13th and 14th centuries, and especially with the Begin movement. In the writings of some of these Begins, like Mechtild of Magdeburg or Hadewig, we find similar expressions of oneness with God, and especially in the French mystic Marguerite Porete, who had been burnt at the stake for heresy in 1310, so right around the time that Eckhart would hang around in Paris as well. Eckhart was familiar with
That's what a lot of people do.
masterpiece, The Mirror
Vroom,
of Simple
vroom, vroom,
Souls,
I
which
drive a
is
car.
what got her executed,
Vroom,
was by some of the
vroom,
great
vroom,
scholastic
vroom,
philosophers and theologians like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, but also
vroom, vroom,
by some of the
vroom,
beguines that were
vroom,
flourishing in the region at the time, both in language and also in ideas. But the concept of ground or
Is that what's quoting?
its identity
Like,
with both God and the soul is really only the starting point of Eckhart's very complex theology and metaphysics. He has a lot more to say on subjects like, well, God, the soul, creation, and ethics, among much more. The more scholastic metaphysics of Eckhart's works, expressed in his Latin treatises and commentaries on the Bible, paints the picture of a very complex and often hard to understand theology. Eckhart even warns himself that if not understood properly, many of the things he says will come off as heretical.
I hate that
go
fucking
through here,
sound.
so bear with me.
Cars.
But let's start with that very central thing to